Hello everyone and welcome to the channel where I talk about the most interesting facts about weapons from movies, games and real life. In this video, we'll be discussing silencers. You'll learn who invented them, how they actually work in real life, and what's a myth. I'll talk about the history of these fascinating devices and where they were used. You'll also find out which weapon is currently considered the craziest in the world. If this sounds interesting, then hit like and watch the video to the end. First, let's find out when the very first silencer appeared and to whom we owe its invention. The earliest attempts to at least somewhat reduce the noise level of a gunshot began back in the late 19th century. By that time, smokeless powder had been invented, and since shots were now less visually noticeable, the next step was to do something about the noise. A whole bunch of engineers and designers jumped into this race at once. Patents were granted one after another. For example, Swiss designer Christopher Powell patented his first silencer in 1894. Then in 1898, French Colonel Humbert introduced a ball valve device that attached to the muzzle of a weapon. A year later, Danish designers patented their multi-chamber silencer model. However, these were all just patents, basically just diagrams on paper brought to the patent office saying, "Here's a silencer design, if anyone builds something similar, they owe me money." But none of these inventors actually got to the point of mass production. That changed when Hiram Percy Maxim, who was one of the first to set up serial production of his silencers. He and his father not only produced them but released newer versions and various improved models every year. By around 1910, these silencers had already entered mass production. Interestingly, to this day, we call this device a silencer simply because Hiram's patent listed it as a silencer. What about Russia? There were indeed some developments there as well, with Alexander Ertel studying ways to reduce the noise of artillery fire. However, as for small arms, especially advanced developments, there wasn't much. And those who did think about reducing the noise of ordinary firearms had to abandon their silencer ideas because at the time there was no concept of stealth combat or anything like that. Instead, battles were fought head-on with the largest caliber weapons available and soldiers were treated as cannon fodder. If that was the case, why would anyone bother spending money on silencers for cannon fodder? Only much later did the USSR begin to take this issue more seriously. Silencers only became popular in the 1920s. Here's an interesting point. It wasn't the military that initially gave them a boost, but hunters who immediately appreciated the usefulness of such devices. Hunting carbines with legal silencers began to appear, but in time, the criminal world also realized their convenience. As a result, their sale was banned almost everywhere. Now, let's figure out what kinds of silencers exist, how they work, and how they differ from one another. A silencer is needed to conceal the sound of a shot and the visible muzzle flash, or at least that's what we've come to believe. In numerous movies and games, silencers are shown as miraculous devices that let you shoot enemies standing just a meter apart without anyone noticing you. In reality, a silencer does perform nearly this same function, but its properties differ from what we usually imagine. Essentially, a silencer is constructed so that the flame and propellant gases are quenched by the device's internal baffles. After passing through several chambers, 5-10 or so, the exiting gases are more contained. However, the sound itself doesn't just vanish. According to expert estimates, the sound of a gunshot is reduced from around 160 decibels to about 130 decibels. That's still not quite at all. It's merely enough to make it harder to locate you by the sound of your shot from a distance. If you fire even from 100 meters away, everyone around will still hear the shot just fine. Also, you can't just screw a silencer onto any rifle and suddenly shoot noiselessly. You need special subsonic ammunition. If you use ordinary supersonic ammo, the bullet breaking the sound barrier will still produce a loud crack that the silencer cannot mask. Even with subsonic rounds, those that travel slower than the speed of sound, you won't be able to replicate what you see in movies. In reality, a silencer isn't for silently killing enemies unnoticed. It's more for the shooter's own comfort, to reduce the sound by about 30 decibels so the shooter doesn't damage their eardrums. Additionally, the silencer hides muzzle flashes, making it harder for the enemy to pinpoint your location by sight. It also becomes more difficult to locate the exact position of the shooter by sound alone because the sound disperses more quickly. In Russian terminology, silencers are classified into two types: PPS, devices for noiseless and flashless shooting, and PMS, devices for maximum sound reduction. These are essentially two different kinds of devices. A PPS example would be something like a AS Val or VSS Ventores rifles specifically designed with noiseless shooting in mind from the outset. They use subsonic ammo and are constructed so that any noise from moving parts is minimized. The silencer integrated into such rifles, or PPS, can only work with subsonic rounds. This is the type of silencer we stereotypically imagine, one that truly makes the weapon almost silent. However, very few weapons use PPS. The second type, PMS, device for reducing the sound of a shot, also known as a tactical silencer, is what we encounter most frequently. This device is designed for both subsonic and supersonic ammunition, which, as we already know, won't produce the movie-like silent effect. These devices are primarily used for the shooter's benefit, to slightly reduce the gun's loudness by muffling the exit gas noise. They don't turn you into a silent killer. PMS devices also reduce recoil due to the extra weight at the muzzle, and by minimizing flash, they make it easier for the shooter to stay on target. In general, hunters often use such silencers to lower the overall volume of the shot. The quieter the shot, the less likely animals are to be frightened off and flee. There's another interesting story about why, in the US, silencers are treated almost on par with fully automatic weapons. In other words, the silencer itself is legally considered like a separate firearm. It all started in the 1920s. At that time in the US, several particularly dangerous gangster groups were active. Any gang shootout made front-page news. Simultaneously, cinemas were flooded with gangster movies where criminals almost always carried Thompson submachine guns. To combat gangsters, lawmakers decided to take action. In 1934, they pushed through a bill that banned or heavily taxed just about everything related to firearms: pistols, automatics, machine guns, and basically anything that could fire a shot. They didn't completely ban them, but imposed a $200 tax for ownership. Why $200? Because that was roughly the cost of a Thompson submachine gun at the time. To understand the impact, $200 then is equivalent to about $4,000 today. So you'd go buy a shotgun for $20 and then pay an additional $200 tax on top. It's hard to say what lawmakers were thinking. Criminals during Prohibition were rolling in money and wouldn't care about the tax on a Thompson. Later, the US government realized that imposing a $200 tax on a $5 revolver wasn't the best idea. Voters wouldn't be happy, and ordinary citizens wouldn't be able to afford weapons to defend themselves from gangsters. So, to calm the public, they removed pistols from the high tax list. But since the bill had been rushed and all suspicious devices were lumped together, silencers ended up staying on the list. As a result, even today, nearly a century later, in some US states, the laws have barely changed, and you still have to pay a $200 tax to own a silencer. What's worse is the 6 months to a year of bureaucratic red tape required to get that silencer in the US. You might be curious which weapon is currently the quietest. It's the 9mm pistol VP9. This weapon is practically perfect. First, it has no automatic action at all. This means when you fire, you won't hear the bolt clattering or a fresh sound being chambered automatically. The VP9 is essentially a bolt-action pistol, resembling a bolt-action rifle in its mechanism. In the VP9, spent casings don't even eject automatically. You have to manually remove the spent casing and load a new round with a handle at the back. Additionally, the VP9 has an innovative silencer at the end of the barrel, and it doesn't even have an opening for the bullet to exit in the usual sense. Now, let's talk about games. Let's consider in which games silencers are depicted incorrectly. Honestly, that would be almost all games. Take the famous Hitman, where you play as Agent 47, grown in a test tube, known for his stealthiness and elusiveness. In the game, as expected, our agent can easily handle his pistols equipped with silencers, taking out enemies left and right, often standing just a few steps apart from each other without anyone noticing. In reality, if someone fired a shot from any normal weapon right next to you, even with a silencer, 100% of the time you'd immediately know that was a gunshot. There'll be no stealthiness about it. What about Escape from Tarkov, known for its realism? It's slightly better. The game features a large variety of silencers for different needs, and each silencer has a loudness parameter that indicates how sound diminishes with distance. However, in the game, starting at about 200 meters, the gunshot source practically disappears when using almost any suppression weapon. In reality, achieving that effect would require special subsonic ammo and a special weapon design. So Tarkov is currently the closest to reality, but still not perfect. Let me know in the comments what new things you learned about silencers from this video.